worked solid for a week, clearing the bungalow out.
I felt ill.
I don't think we talked to each other, but you know, it destroys you because you kind of think this is everything that Mum and Dad have worked for.
Yeah. Just looking at all the things.
Everything was empty. You know, I guess it was like they didn't have had a life. It was almost like it was obliterated. It was gone. You know, everything that they had, they owned, was gone.
You know, you'd pick something up and you'd think, well, shall I keep it or shall I not? And we went into the garden shed and the forks and all that was there. And we thought, well, you know, that was Dad's. We've got to give it away.
Old age is meant to be a time of retirement and relaxation, but the reality can be somewhat different. As people get older, many become fragile. Some need looking after. That might mean help getting dressed a couple of mornings a week or full-time care in a residential home. Either way, most people in this country think that their social care will be free. It's not. The seaside town of Margate in Kent has undoubtedly seen better times. Sadly, so have many of its residents. 1 in 5 here are pensioners, and that number is going up. In the next 20 years, the number of people over the age of 85 in the UK is set to top 10 million. That will bring with it a massive demand for social care. I've come to meet 2 sisters who've had a highly unsatisfactory but not unusual experience of the care system. Many people are forced to sell their houses and give up their life savings just to afford decent social care. That's why I'm here.
And they're having to keep...
3 years ago, Pauline and Barbara found out that their mum Anne had Alzheimer's. She deteriorated quickly.
After 10...
About 10 years after Dad died, I started to get these phone calls. How much have I got to pay the gardener?
Yeah, or the window cleaner.
And I felt, I was, you know, sort of thinking, well, what's going on? But instead of me, sort of, because I didn't know anything about Alzheimer's or anything like that.
Don't.
And I thought, why is she doing that? So I went round there and sorted out the money, and I got quite cross with her because she was ringing me every 5 minutes of the day. And she just looked totally lost.
After a short stay in hospital, Anne could no longer look after herself. She needed to go into a home. But there was one thing that she hadn't banked on.
Okay, I didn't have any idea actually what was involved in the costs until that finance person came. And she turned around and she said, well, your mother will have to pay for herself. But 18 months down the line, I ended up paying altogether £27,000 to Kent County Council.
They had to spend another £56,000 on a care plan for Anne. It covers most of the cost of her care home. But they were forced to sell the bungalow that Anne and her husband had worked all of their lives to buy.
And I mean, let's face it, they didn't have much money. They didn't earn much money in those days. And when they bought their first property, it was £2,000.
£2,000, yes.
But that was a lot of money when you was only earning, what?
£10, Dad.
If that. I was only earning £10 when I would have worked, so, you know, they were
Mum's
probably earning that. So there wasn't much money at all, but I guess they thought, well, if you buy your own property, when you get to your old age, you've actually got some equitable somewhere. And obviously, my mum and dad obviously wanted to leave an inheritance to us two, and Barbara's 2 children, because I don't have no children. But so, you know, that's what she's always wanted to do. So I'm only pleased that she's got what she's got in a way that she doesn't know where her money's going.
Anne's care home is just a short drive from where they live.
We've been here 16 years. Yeah, I mean,
Anne is now 92. the sisters still visit her nearly every day.
Well, I'm all right. How are you?
I don't know, I'm
A bit confused, are you? Condemned, are you? Who's going to condemn you?
I don't know.
I don't know.
How about
Can I just
smiling?
have a glass of your
No,
paint?
that's it. See, you still got your bracelet on.
Yeah, I'd like another one then.
Would you? No, we? Before I go into work. Yeah, I've got to go to work later, but... Right. Oh, thank you, love. They've taken your nail varnish off, haven't they?
Yeah, I want it.
Yeah, I'm going to cut those. They don't look very good. I'm taking myself home.
We'll look after her. We'll look after her.
Lee's got her birthday. Yeah.
But paying for your own care does have its benefits.
When you get to a certain point in your life and you need care, then if you have to pay, you then get choices. And you have the choice of where you want to go, what you want to do, the quality of the home, the quality of the room. Whereas if you haven't got your money, you haven't got those choices. So Pauline's quite lucky in terms of the fact that she did pick where she wanted to go, and all right, she's paying for it. But we've all got to pay for things.
But Jonathan admits the care system still has big problems. Lots of people talk about how confusing the system is. They don't know how to get the right information.
Oh, hardly surprising. I don't know
you're
anymore.
a care manager. You're a care manager. Do you understand? Do you know the system?
I haven't got a clue. And that's bad, isn't it?
Pauline has one last thing to show me. This was Anne's home. It sold for £140,000 2 years ago.
It's just a happy home, we just come and go.
£97,000 of that has already been spent on
It's
care.
sad to actually walk away from it.
It seems a cruel reward for a lifetime's work.
My mum's neighbours.
But cost is not the only problem with this system. It's incredibly complicated. There are actually 152 different social care systems across England, one for each of the local authorities in the country. Each local council organises their budget in different ways, and for most people, that means that the amount you pay for care depends on where you live. Andrew Dixon Smith is an independent financial advisor. He specialises in explaining how social care systems work.
And I mean, we don't have any geographical boundaries.
So why all the local inconsistencies?
I think this has always existed in as much as there's been national guidelines for, say, local authorities to work under, but every local authority's got its own budgets, and therefore the budgets tend to be used in a different way.
Is there a postcode lottery?
Definitely, yeah.
Are we ready? Yes?
Yes, 1 minute.
I think so.
Now, pensioners aren't averse to a bit of gambling, but I don't think they had their social care in mind.
26.
Just to give you an idea of how much care costs can vary, I took a look at the average hourly cost of what's known as domiciliary care. That's the most basic care you can get in your own home.
6 and 1.
The average is about £13 an hour, but that varies massively depending on where you live. Some of the lucky ones live in Tower Hamlets. There, home care is free.
31.
But in Brighton, an hour of the same care will set you back £21 an hour. But if the NHS is free, why do we pay for our own social care? Well, the answer lies in the period just after many of today's pensioners were born. The current system was set up along with the rest of the welfare state in 1948. While the Labour government was convinced that healthcare should be free, they didn't understand the challenge of elderly social care. There wasn't much need to either, because the average life expectancy was just 67. It's now 80. People didn't live as long, so they usually didn't need care homes. And because of that, they weren't hit with the costs that many of today's pensioners face. Times have changed, the social care system has not. People have been trying to change the system for decades. So far, they failed. In 1999, a Royal Commission said that a radical overhaul of the elderly care system was needed. it didn't happen. 2 years ago, Labour tried to introduce what became known as a death tax. Unsurprisingly, that didn't happen either. Nothing has been done, and even the government admits that the system is out of date. So the longer people live, the more likely they are to need care, and expensive care at that. But should the government really be paying more to help the elderly? Last summer, a group of experts cooked up a report proposing just that. They'd been asked by the government to look at how social care was funded. The Dilnot Commission had 3 big ideas. The first one was that you should never spend more than £35,000 on social care. Once you'd spent that much, the government would step in and pay the rest. Right now, there's no limit on the amount you can spend. Second, the report said that you should only have to pay the costs of a care home if you have assets worth more than £100,000. As things stand, you have to start paying if you have assets worth £23,000, and that includes the value of your home and your savings. Of course, if the change did come in, it would mean the government footing the bill for more people. Finally, the report says that everybody's care needs should be assessed in the same way. That's because at the minute it's decided locally by different councils in different ways. But how would it all work? Oxford houses one of the most famous universities in the world. It has been a place of learning for more than 900 years, and the town's colleges are home to many of the brains of Britain. It's exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find the man tasked with finding a solution to one of the government's most difficult problems. Andrew Dilnot was the head of the Commission on Funding of Care and Support. It became known as the Dilnot Commission. He is the principal of St Hugh's College and a highly respected economist. When the government asked him to look at the way social care was funded, what he found was a system in crisis.
The social care system's broken. We've had essentially the same structures for nearly 60 years now, and they don't work. Social care, which is something that most of us are going to need as we grow older, 3/4 of us are likely to need some kind of social care. Growing older should be something that we can celebrate. We don't celebrate at the moment because people are terrified they won't be looked after properly. So this is a crucial part of how we live as individuals and as a society. It was recognised by the coalition agreement that it was an urgent area for change. The previous government wanted to do something about it, although failed. So this is something we really need to get on with. It very seriously affects all of us, and there are ways of making some improvements.
But the government is stalling on introducing reforms.
And so one of the things that we put in our report was a quote from the coalition agreement. In the coalition agreement, the government said, "We understand the urgency of reforming the system of social care to provide much more control to individuals and their carers and to ease the cost burden that they and their families face." Well, it was there in the coalition agreement at the very beginning of the government that they understood the urgency of reforming the system. Well, if they understood the urgency, they should get on with it.
One of the problems is the cost.
I think there are a couple of things to say about the cost. The first is that our estimate of the cost, £1.7 billion a year, is what it would cost once they were fully implemented. It will take a while at the moment for the introduction of legislation, for that legislation to pass, and then for the costs to build up, because until people reach the cap, costs don't start coming in. So in this Parliament, we're talking about low hundreds of millions of pounds a year. But I think the bigger point is that if we look at the £2 billion a year, which will rise over the next 10 or 15 years to £3 billion or even more because the number of older people is growing, which we should celebrate, that's actually a very small amount relative to the overall level of public spending. If we take £2 billion a year now, total public spending is £700 billion. So we're talking about between 1/350th and 1/400th of public spending. Now, the suggestion that government doesn't have the ability to reorganise either the current level of public spending or the level of taxation by 1/350th or 1/400th of the overall level would suggest that government is far more incompetent than it really is.
And as if the government had been listening, they finally took some action. This is what George Osborne had to say in the budget.
We will also address the rising costs of an ageing population and the burden this places on future generations. We will be publishing a white paper on social care. I've also said that we would consider proposals to manage future...
So the government have promised to do something to deal with our social care problems. But is Andrew Dilnot's report the only solution? Could there be another answer right on our doorstep?
In as a form of lunch complement, which is behind Coach K. First calling point today will be Berwick-upon-Tweed's approximately 45 Berwick-upon-Tweed first calling point of this service.
This is Edinburgh. Just like the English, the Scots are getting older. The number of people over the age of 75 will double in the next 20 years. But there is a key difference between Scotland and England. Some social care up here is free. Callum Chomsuk works for Age Scotland. I wanted to know if over 65s in England should be jealous of their Scottish counterparts.
I think there's a lot to be jealous of living in Scotland. We've got a surprisingly sunny day today, which is lovely. There's free bus pass for over 60s in Scotland, and I think it's only over 65s in England. But there is a real misconception about free personal nursing care.
Despite the bus passes and the sunshine, the social care system up here isn't all it's cracked up to be.
In actually a lot of ways, there's more similarities between the Scottish and English system than you'd imagine. People have to be assessed for care packages by the local authorities, and based on need, they'll get their care delivered by the local authority or a third sector, independent sector provider. The principal difference is probably around what we've got free personal nursing care, and that is probably the worst named legislation in Scotland. It gives the impression that all social care for older people in Scotland is free at the point of use. In fact, free personal nursing care just pays a contribution towards older people's care. For most people in residential accommodation, this may only be £160, £170 a week, but they'll still have to find the additional £500, £600, £700 a week to actually look and pay for their hotel costs in residential accommodation. If someone is, however, at home, most of their sort of personal care costs will be met by this legislation.
Just like the English, the Scots face the same rising cost of care. So what's next for Scotland? One of the other problems sounds familiar too.
What you have in Scotland are 32 local authorities tackling social care in 32 different ways. They have not only different services that they're delivering, but most crucially is they have different charging regimes applied to those services. So what you can find is individuals in neighbouring streets can be paying vastly different amounts of money for essentially the same service in Scotland.
The social care system in Scotland is not that different to the one in England, and as we've heard, it faces many of the same problems. But almost all of the over 65s here get some of their care costs free, and that's more than you can say for their English counterparts. But according to Jackie Bailey, that's not enough. She's the deputy leader of the Labour Party in Scotland and the Shadow Health Secretary. I asked her if the Scottish could use Dilnot's proposals too.
I think there is much we can learn north and south of the border from the recommendations. But, I think the biggest social policy challenge we face is how we care for our older people and how we pay for that care. Moving forward, I would have hoped that the political parties across the spectrum would seize the opportunity that Dilnot presented to discuss those really hard issues to make sure that the care is there, properly paid for, delivered in a fair and equitable way as we move into the future. Certainly in Scotland, I have been pushing the government to look at Dilnot, to look at what we need to learn. at the end of the day, we still experience the same challenges, the same problems in delivering for our older people. Now, we know the statistics don't lie. The number of older people is getting greater, and that is something to be celebrated. But equally, we're not, whilst we are living longer, we're not necessarily healthier. So the issue of care and funding of care matters, not just now, but very much into the future. So we welcome the Dilnot Commission. I think it should act as a stimulus for debate, not just in England and Wales, but indeed in Scotland as well.
I went to Scotland thinking that the social care system there might hold the secrets to looking after an ageing population. But as it turns out, it seems that they need the Dilnot Commission's proposals just as much as we do. All we need now is the government to deliver on its promise. The Queen's speech lays out what the government is planning to do for the next year. If there's to be any chance of reforming the way social care is funded, it needs to be read by Her Majesty. But from the very first few words, there didn't seem to be much hope for social care reforms that would cost the government rather a lot of money.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government's legislative programme will focus on economic growth, justice and constitutional reform. My Minister's first priority will be to reduce the deficit and restore economic stability.
And sure enough, Dilnot's proposals were nowhere to be found.
But while there's plenty about children and families, there's no full social care bill, and so no plans for how to fund care for millions of elderly people. And that's left many in the working sector frustrated and disappointed. So all in all...
One of the organisations left frustrated and disappointed is the Care Quality Commission. They regulate the social care system. Alan Rosenbach is their special policy advisor. The question is, what will happen now that the government have failed to adopt Dilnot's proposals?
I suppose more people will be outside the scope of being able to access care. And that will be devastating, I think, for them and for their families. And that will be the implication of all this if we don't begin to challenge the financial issues that we're currently faced with. This will just be a gradual erosion of the capability of the state to be able to respond to the requirements of people with care needs. And I think the really unfortunate thing is that what we'll have is just a greater number of older adults in 5 years' time who are really anxious about what the care system can do for them, how they're going to get the most out of it, how they're going to protect their resources. It'll be that gradual erosion about confidence in the system being able to respond to people's needs.
Rosenbach was full of praise for the Dilnot Commission's recommendations.
Well, the Dilnot Commission report, I think, is excellent. What Dilnot was attempting to do was just to look at the needs of a proportion of the population who need adult social care. And the key focus for him in his report was to try and take the fear out of this, because the challenge for people as they get into these latter stages of their lives and they need care, they become really frightened. The system is difficult to understand. It's impenetrable to most people. They don't understand how it works. First time they realise they're going to have to make a contribution to the costs of their care is when they need these services. Whether they will or won't have to sell their house if they're property owners becomes a really big and significant issue for people. So there's a lot of fear associated with this. What I think Dilnot sought to do is to simply take the fear out of this. And his proposals are really fairly straightforward and simple, that there's a relationship between the state and the citizen about how the costs of care are going to be met in the future.
As always, it seems that money is the issue. Dilnot's recommendations aren't cheap. They'd set the government back nearly £2 billion a year. And after all, we are in the middle of a recession. But in the long run, Andrew Dilnot thinks that his proposals could actually save the government money.
There is scope for moving public spending around. There is scope for raising taxes to pay for new things. So I fully recognise that this is not a perfect time to be making proposals to increase spending. But it's important to realise that if we don't do anything in the area of social care, we have two problems. The really big problem, which is that we condemn people to continuing to live lives which are far more miserable than they need to be, and those are lives that could affect all of us. And then the slightly grubbier economic problem, but still a significant one, which is that our current social care system is so inefficient that we end up with far more people in our National Health Service costing very large amounts of money than we ought to. There are far more people who, because of ineffectiveness in the social care system, end up in the National Health Service than would be the case if we had a better system. So in the long run, it's quite plausible that the net cost of this might be negative, because if we can get a more efficient structure, then we can keep people out of the health service, which is much, much more expensive than the social care system.
But can that really be true? Joe Webber works for the NHS Confederation. They represent all the organisations that provide NHS services.
I think it's very possible that if you use the Dilnot model of a balance between the individual and the state responsibility to fund care, then you could actually improve things for the NHS in terms of the funding, but also, more importantly, improve the experience of older people when they're receiving care. So we need a robust social care system to make sure that the NHS can get the most out of the money it's got, can also provide high quality care. We need high quality social care to balance that at the same time.
I wanted to speak to Paul Burstow, the Social Care Minister, but just like everyone else from the Department of Health, he refused to speak to me. Whatever's going on in that building, I'm not going to hear it from anyone that works there. What I do know is that Mr Burstow says that cross-party talks are ongoing, but Labour is now threatening to pull out. The trouble is, they won't speak to me either. It seems we've come full circle. Similar talks were held before the 2010 general elections. They failed. Back then, it was Labour in power and the Conservatives in opposition. Both promised change. Both have failed to deliver. These over 65s know what it's like to be kept waiting. Under the watchful eye of the Queen, whose speech promised so much and delivered so little, they will keep on dancing. But they're left in limbo yet again, waiting for the government to change things. I'm reminded of some of the things I've been told over the last few months.
I've likened social care to being like standing in the middle of the road with a lorry driving towards you, and the best you can hope is that you'll die before the lorry gets to you.
That's the thing. Stop talking. Let's see some action.
Everybody we've spoken to says that things need to change. Even the government admits it. But their policy making falls short. In the next couple of years, many of these dancers will need some form of social care. But for them and their relatives, they face the same old broken system.